Starting off at number 15, the worst building in the game is the Barbarian Hut, which is going right into F tier. The main reason why this card is so bad is because it's pretty expensive at 6 Elixir, and things like the Earthquake and the Poison, which are common spells in the meta, pretty much kill it entirely for a positive Elixir trade. And it is very difficult to fit in decks because of how costly it is and how little value it gets in a lot of situations that you're not really seeing it in any meta deck. And the Barbarian waves it spawns are just fairly easy to counter because you have so much time in between each wave, so you have plenty of time to save Elixir and prepare for them too. Next up is the Furnace, which is joining the Barbarian Hut in F tier because it is almost as bad as it. Even though the Furnace is cheaper than the Barbarian Hut at 4 Elixir, the same thing still applies. The Earthquake and the Poison and other spells just get so much value against it, and it is also not versatile at all. What's even worse for the Furnace is the new Tower Troops, the Cannoneer, and the Dagger Duchess fully counter the Fire Spirit wave, so if you're playing against the Furnace and you have one of those Tower Troops, it is doing literally nothing to your towers if you ignore it. And finishing off the F tier here, we have another spawner, the Goblin Hut. Similar to the Furnace and the Barbarian Hut, it is just way too vulnerable to spells like the Earthquake and the Poison and others. And then similar to the other two, it just doesn't pair well in any deck. It is just not versatile whatsoever. And then a really big issue with the Goblin Hut is because of how many people are using the Dagger Duchess. The Dagger Duchess can pretty much pick off all of the Spear Goblins before they even hit the tower. So the Goblin Hut is just not getting really any value in so many situations, which are why all these spawners are in F tier. Starting off C tier with the fourth worst building in the game, we got the Goblin Cage. Now, I'm not saying the Goblin Cage is really bad, I just think it's a bit worse in comparison to most of the other buildings in the game. I think one of the biggest problems with it is you cannot really use it at all inside of cycle decks. You can only use it in heavier decks, like with the Royal Recruits. You can maybe use it with the Balloon, E-Giant, things along those lines, so it kind of limits what you can use it in. Another thing is it's practically useless against air decks, and the other thing too is the structure itself is very weak and doesn't really have a lot of hit points, so I think the main value people are getting from it is from that brawler that eventually spawns, but not really as a building itself. Next up, we got the Inferno Tower. Of course, it is going to be very good against beatdown decks, like if your opponent is using something like a Golem, a Lava Hound, or a Giant, which we are seeing a lot more of, to be fair, because of the Dagger Duchess. But the problem is, if you are against a cycle deck or a bunch of swarm cards, the Inferno Tower is practically useless. Also, if you happen to play against a deck that has a Lightning or an Evolve Zap in it, even if it's a beatdown deck, they're going to be able to find a way to break through anyways, because they have a solid reset to that Inferno. We're going to finish off C tier with the Tombstone. The Tombstone is definitely one of the best spawners. I think one of the reasons why it is better than the ones in F tier is because of how cheap it is. At 3 Elixir, it means it is a lot easier to cycle, which is why you commonly see this inside of Lava Hound decks. And before, we used to always see it in Splash Yard, but now a lot of Graveyard players prefer to use Giant Graveyard instead of the Tombstone, which is why it's not really going to be much higher than C. Also, another negative of this card is spells like Poison and especially Earthquake are just such a fantastic counter to it, and also it does practically nothing against air decks too. We're going to start off B tier with the Mortar. Now, the Mortar has a lot of uses. You can actually use it defensively to defend things like a Hog Rider or a Giant, for example, but you can also use it on offense to try to get a Mortar lock on your opponent's tower. And it's also a fairly versatile card, as in there's a few different things you can pair with the Mortar, but the reason why I think it's B tier and not A anymore is because one of the main reasons why people use the regular Mortar is just to get to that Evolved Mortar. And I also think Mortar's a bit worse now because a lot of the baity cards that pair well with the Mortar get killed so easily from the Dagger Duchess, which is why we have seen a lot less Mortar recently ever since the Dagger Duchess got added to the game. The Bomb Tower is also going to go into B tier. Kind of like the Mortar, it used to be a lot better and used to be in more like A tier, but because of the recent meta, there hasn't been as many spammy or swarmy type of decks, or as many people using things like Royal Hogs where it's really necessary to use the Bomb Tower. Also, there's a ton of beatdown where you really want to have more direct damage and not as much splash, which is why people are preferring to use things like the Tesla. But with that being said, the Bomb Tower is definitely a very solid structure. The fact that it deals splash damage and has a pretty solid amount of health too, so it's pretty sturdy even against things like spells. Expo is also going to go into the B tier. I consider it to be a slightly above average building right now. Some of the good things about it is it's pretty versatile at the moment. Pump Bow is pretty good in this current meta. It goes well with the Elixir Collector. It's also very good with the Evolved Tesla, which is one of the best evolutions at the moment. You can use Ice Bow with the Ice Wizard. You could use 2.9 Expo, 3.0 Expo, so pretty versatile as you can tell. But one of the problems is Beatdown is very good again because of the Dagger Duchess, so things of course like Golem and Giant are used a lot, which are a great counter to the Expo, which is why it balances it out and it's kind of slightly above average at the moment. And now we're going to wrap up B tier here with the Cannon. The Cannon has always been one of the best buildings in the game until recently. Now this is why I consider it B, even though it has been A for the longest time. It's because the meta is a bit different and we're seeing less cycle. There's less people running Hog Rider and Royal Hogs and things along those lines. But with that being said, the Cannon is still a very versatile building. You can use it in many decks that you want to use it in, and you can even run it inside of beatdown decks. Like you can use it with the Electro Giant. It can be a useful tool for defending the graveyard. It's just not that great against air though, and people tend to prefer the Tesla at the moment. We're going to start off A tier with the Goblin Drill. Now this is a tiny bit of a prediction because the Goblin Drill right now at this point in time is in S tier, but as we see in the recent balance changes, it is going to be getting a nerf. So I believe that is going to bring it down a tier and help balance it out a tiny bit. But recently it has been absolutely broken because of how versatile it is. You can use so many different cards with it, and of course so many different evolutions you can play with it too. It is really difficult for your opponent to deal with because if they don't have the proper drill counter in rotation or even have one in their deck, it is pretty much impossible to deal with, and it is the reason why Miner is a lot worse now because drill has pretty much replaced it as a win condition in so many decks. The Elixir Collector is also going in A tier. Now this is a little bit of a prediction because kind of like the Goblin Drill, it is also getting a small nerf in the upcoming balance changes, which I believe brings it down from S tier to A. Recently though, the Elixir Collector has been absolutely broken, which is probably a surprise to a lot of people because it used to be one of the worst buildings in the game, but the reason why is because of the Dagger Duchess, because you can go in for an Elixir Collector, and because people can't play into the two Duchesses, you pretty much are able to defend the pump really easily, and if someone goes in for a Miner on the pump, it gets absolutely melted. So all because of the new Tower Troop, the Elixir Collector went from being one of the worst buildings in the game to one of the best buildings. The regular Tesla is going into A tier. I believe this is by far one of the best buildings in the game. One of the reasons why is because of how versatile it is. You can play it in pretty much any cycle deck you can think of, whether it's Expo, whether it's Miner Cycle, or Drill Cycle, or Hog Cycle, or with the Royal Hogs, you name it. And of course, when you play that Tesla, you're getting closer to being able to play that Evolved Tesla, which is another reason why people are so inclined to wanting to use it. And of course, it is pretty effective against air cards like the Balloon and the Lava Hound, which a lot of people are using. And that is the one thing a lot of the other buildings in the game lack. They do not do well against air decks, but the Tesla does. Now we're in S tier, and we are starting S tier off with the Evolved Mortar. It is basically the regular Mortar, but way better because of course it fires a goblin and it has a faster attack rate. Now in the balance changes, we see it is getting its health boost taken away if it stands and stays that way, but I believe even if it gets that extra health it has compared to the Mortar taken away, it'll still be very good because of that goblin and the faster fire rate. That just changes so many interactions and just helps you out a lot on defense. Or if you get a Mortar lock on the tower, you are getting significantly more chip damage because of that goblin. And probably no surprises here, the best building in the game is the Evolved Tesla, because the regular Tesla itself is already very good, but the Evolved Tesla has that shockwave. Right now, the Evolved Tesla has 20% more health, but the balance change coming up is going to take away that extra health, but you know what's going to be added is a shockwave when the Tesla dies. So you're getting an extra shockwave, which is going to help you out so much defensively. That shockwave gets so much value when there's bait and a ton of things clumped together, and even when you're against a heavier win condition, that shockwave is very helpful because it stuns it and helps slow it down. So for that reason, that is why the Evolved Tesla is the best building in the game. So many people are running it because of how versatile it is too. What do you guys think of my building tier list? Make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and comment below what you guys would change.